Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are in the world. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to the fourth event in our Raising Ambitions series ahead of this week's Leaders Summit on Climate. This program today is focused on John Kerry's challenge to the hydrocarbon industry to lead the effort to build a clean hydrogen economy. The Raising Ambitions series focuses on the higher climate ambitions that the Biden-Harris administration hopes to realize at home in the US and abroad. The series has 12 virtual events, though more do keep getting added, and they're on the technologies critical to realizing these climate goals, sectoral approaches to decarbonization, and focusing on countries that are increasing their commitments to climate action. The aim is to build momentum in advance of the summit and encourage increased ambition from public and private sector actors. Before we get started with today's program, a little housekeeping. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag Raising Ambitions. Second, throughout our discussion today, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can. So now on to the program. Hydrogen is one of the key technologies we're highlighting in the Raising Ambitions series, and it will indeed be critical to decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors. But there is debate around how viable hydrogen is in the transition, whether it's ready to play as large a role as its advocates hope, and how it can or should be scaled quickly and cleanly. At CERAWeek earlier this year, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, challenged the oil and gas industry to take a leadership role in developing the clean hydrogen economy. I want to use John Kerry's remarks as a framing for our discussion today. So I want to go to that video first. So Roger, can you roll that tape?
I mean, there are huge opportunities here. You know this better than anybody, Ernie, that oil and gas has incredible infrastructure, incredible capacity to move energy from one place to another. What if that happened for hydrogen? There's a future in I think, this new partnership as we design the energy modalities of the future. And I think it's a very, very exciting transition that we're looking at.
So that's that. Thank you, Dan, Jurgen, and CERAWeek for giving us permission to use the video. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our panel to kick this off. So in alphabetical order, we have with us today Jill Ivanko, President and Chief Executive Officer of Chart Industries, Wayne Lady, the Hydrogen Commercial Manager for North America at Shell, Michael Liebreich, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer at Liebreich Associates, and Axel Wiedfeld, Chief Executive Officer of Uniper Hydrogen. Cosmo Panzacci, the Executive Vice President for Hydrogen at SNAM, might also be joining us. So Jill, I want to start with you for the questions, since you published an article responding to John Kerry's challenge, which in many ways was actually the impetus for how we thought about this event today. So Jill, why did you and Chart take up John Kerry's challenge?
Yeah, so it's great to be here and be here with this great panel. So here at Chart, we design and manufacture cryogenic technologies and equipment for a variety of molecules and applications across the clean energy and the industrial gas spaces. So part of the impetus behind this was around our design and manufacturing of hydrogen liquefaction process and equipment for the entire hydrogen supply chain. We've been doing it for over 50 years. Nobody really cared about it till last May. Nobody paid attention to it until then. But what we've seen is it's really become a part of what we believe to be the hybrid solution through the clean energy transition and destination. And part of our impetus of pushing that agenda forward is that we sit in a unique position in the middle of that value chain. We're the liquefaction process and equipment provider to the producers of the molecule itself, through the transport and the storage of the molecule, and also to the end users of it, whether that's FCEVs, fueling stations, you name it, across the board. And what we've seen through that unique position in the value chain are some of the challenges, but also some of the benefits of hydrogen. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today to get into some of the details around that. Hydrogen is unique in many ways, not just from a technical perspective when talking about its liquid density, which benefits transport and storage, refueling time, distance, but also when you compare it to other power sources in the market evolution. And what I mean by that is that there are more industries in nearly every brand name company you hear about talking about it as part of their solution. And there's a lot more industry collaboration and partnering like we've never seen before, whether that was oil field or LNG, CNG, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. So I am a firm believer that the energy transition is going to be a hybrid of power sources, but I'm also a firm believer that liquid hydrogen can be a significant part of the solution, in particular here in the United States. And the bottom line is, in order to address the cost and scalable challenges that we have for this to be a key part of it, we felt that calling out John Kerry's comments was really important to bring both public and private sector attention to the discussion.
Got it. Well, thank you for really highlighting that. Again, as I said, it was part of what led us to frame this event this way. We thought that was a really valuable thing to call out, and really important to challenge the industry to think really aggressively about hydrogen. And I know you sit in the middle of the value chain, but from your customer's perspective, where do you see some of the immediate wins? Where do you see your customers developing hydrogen end use cases are early on in the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, so primarily what we've been seeing is around fueling and transportation, so the mobility markets. And I think that goes toward, these are smaller, easier early wins, but it also builds out that infrastructure. So for example, in the United States, California has a head start, and there's been a lot of work there on the fueling station side. But it doesn't really work if you own a vehicle in California and you want to go to the East Coast, because you're not going to get there. There's nowhere to get refueled. So a lot of the early day wins are kind of creating ways to connect that infrastructure and that network. And that's what we are seeing more and more of in the next couple of years. The opposite end of the spectrum there's quite a bit of large demonstration projects around how is that molecule going to be produced. And I think that's a really important conversation of the colors of hydrogen and what that evolution is going to look like. I mean, it's great to say we're going to go to green, but the reality is we need to be pragmatic about how we get there. And I think that's you're going to see more and more of that in the first half of this decade. And then the third piece we see, and I think is going to be a really significant portion of the answer, is the combination of hydrogen with other renewables and energy storage. And that can also, even go outside of where you start at the upstream point all the way through to the end use application to the carbon capture side of things. So again, I think the way to characterize it is the hybrid approach, whether it's color, whether it's storage, whether it's other renewables, or the network itself.
Jill, thank you. And I know we're going to try to touch on a lot of those issues that you raised throughout this hour. I want to move next to Wayne. Wayne, Shell has been investing pretty heavily into hydrogen projects, including a recently announced blue hydrogen facility in the UK. What is your reaction to John Kerry's challenge, and how can Shell support the development of clean hydrogen economy?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just echo, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for the invitation. A bit of my background, I've been with Shell 10 years working on Hydrogen 4, so I've been on this journey for a while. And then prior to joining Shell, I studied these energy transitions, vehicle technologies, and energy infrastructures. So personally, what a great pleasure to be working to deliver now those transitions that I studied long ago. I thought the comments from Mr. Kerry were insightful in a few ways. Acceleration and scale truly is a virtuous cycle in hydrogen. It's somewhat unique in that as it gets bigger, it gets better and easier in some ways. That's not always the case. And we have a tremendous pace of progress that's happening. The second, specific to fossil fuel companies becoming energy companies, we do have a lot of useful infrastructure to modify through these transitions. We also do have a lot of capability to move energy around, whether it's the physical movements or the trading that result in a reliable and resilient and affordable energy system that is decarbonized. And the last, I think, is to do all that safely. There's a lot of transferable experience from oil and gas activities into the new energies space. And then finally, it's about approaches to serving customers at retail sites for mobility and unlocking some of those synergies with coupling of sectors, integration across these energy markets. A bit later in the video, Mr. Kerry also referred to a jump ball, in that there's a big opportunity to create some leadership, create new industries, do some infrastructure stimulus with hydrogen. Of course, we are global. I'm responsible for North America, so I'm maturing those opportunities here. And for Shell, about a third of our company's activities are in North America. So we're very keen to be successful in hydrogen in North America and in the U.S. But certainly, it's a landscape that's heating up. Other countries and regions doing a lot to progress hydrogen.
Wayne, how do you see hydrogen relating to, whether competing with or complementing some of the other clean energy technologies that Shell is investing in? Do you see it as a complementary? Do you see that there is going to be a competition for, say, ground transportation between electrification and hydrogen?
Yeah, we see it very complementary, and it's a rich topic that we can dig into more. In high level terms, we have a renewables and energy solutions group that is investing across the full range of renewable energy production, and also the various routes to market. So charging of battery electric vehicles, producing a full range of biofuels, producing hydrogen and refueling hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So my job is to make hydrogen as good as it can be so that it competes well. And internally, opportunities for hydrogen compete with opportunities for charging of battery electric vehicles and refueling with biofuels, et cetera. At a customer level, we see customer segments for whom charging works very well, for whom refueling with hydrogen works very well. In the infrastructure, we see great synergies. If there's an electron in the right location at the right time, it's great to put it into a battery. But if that electron is stranded, needs to be moved in time and space somewhere else, hydrogen is a great vector for doing that. And also it can be moved to a different market where the value is higher. And then finally, for resiliency in energy systems, intermittent renewables increasing in the penetration onto the grid. What are we doing with all of the waste carbonaceous feedstocks that exist in the world? There's a lot of circular economy and interconnection of sectors that can be facilitated quite well with hydrogen.
Got it. Thank you. I want to dig down later on in the program to sort of how that competition looks between electrification and hydrogen. But for now, we do have Cosma here. Cosma, I'm going to butcher your last name. Apologies. Cosma Panzacci, who's the Executive Vice President for Hydrogen at SNAM. Cosma, welcome. I want to ask you very specifically, makes the hydrocarbon industry well positioned to lead on clean hydrogen. And John Kerry mentioned in that quote, infrastructure. And SNAM, of course, has a big piece of the infrastructure. So maybe you could talk about the infrastructure piece in particular and the role that you see SNAM and the hydrocarbon industry more broadly playing.
Well, Randy, first of all, thank you for having me here today. But I think that the infrastructure piece is actually quite critical to allow for growth in the hydrogen space, which is at the same time fast and efficient. There has been a recent report that was published just last week by a coalition of European transmission system operators. It's called the Hydrogen Backbone, and it's the new version of a past work on this that basically details how we expect new infrastructure to be built to allow for hydrogen transportation across the continent and existing infrastructure to be repurposed. I think this second part is particularly interesting, also looking at the US, given the amount of infrastructure that already exists in North America and how this could potentially be repurposed to move hydrogen around the country. Because one point that I think also Wayne was mentioning before, of course, there is going to be a very interesting demand for low carbon hydrogen in hydrogen consumption hubs that exist already today, like petchem or refining complexes. But hydrogen will also be used as a crucial storage for renewable production. And when I think and look at some issues in terms of resilience of the grid in some part of the United States, that will force us to rethink how the infrastructure is being used. There are some areas in the States where there has been a massive scale up of renewables in the last few years, and the level of curtailment, which means wasted renewable energy, are doubling year after year after year. I think in California, this number has been doubling for 5 years in a row now. And therefore, being able to, couple the evolution of renewables and store that renewable production in a hydrogen facility by using perhaps existing infrastructure that otherwise would be stranded is going to be a crucial element. And just to give you a number, just one single number, we have calculated together with National Grid, ENGIE, Fluxys, and the other major European transmission system operators that moving hydrogen for 1 kilo of hydrogen for 1,000 kilometers through existing pipelines, costs approximately 0.1 euros per kilo, which means less than 5% of the cheapest potential green hydrogen production, not now, but in 2035, 2040.
Got it. Okay, so you said a key phrase that is sort of out there in the ether: stranded assets. And so this is a hard question, but it's one that I think we need to ask of folks in the oil and gas industry, which is how much of the conversation around hydrogen right now is really an effort to avoid stranded assets versus how much of it is really the most efficient pathway towards decarbonizing our economy. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, but you said the magic word stranded assets, so I had to ask.
Well, I think it depends on the different sectors, right? There are some sectors where it makes immediate sense to use hydrogen to decarbonize. Let's make an example here. To produce 1 ton of hydrogen in the so-called gray waste, so with a steam methane reformer today, emits approximately 9 tons of CO2. If you do that with carbon capture and sequestration, you are probably able to capture around 85 to 95% of the emissions. If you do it with green hydrogen, of course, the amount is zero. To give you again a reference and going back also to what Ms. Evanko was mentioning at the beginning, Europe is trying to come out of the discussion between different colors of hydrogen by putting a threshold above which hydrogen is not considered anymore low carbon hydrogen and is considered still CO2 heavy hydrogen. And that threshold will be between 2.2 and 4 tons of CO2 emitted per ton of hydrogen. So going back to your question, I think it depends on a sector by sector analysis. For sure, if you take methane and you outright try to substitute it with hydrogen, it's going to be, as of today, it's going to be a very, very expensive way to eliminate CO2 from the cycle.
Randy, can I reframe your question a bit? Rather than stranded assets, it's about reinvesting into assets to repurpose and use the existing infrastructure for new customers, new applications, including hydrogen, often requires some change and some reinvestment into those assets. The dilemma of a stranded asset, in my mind, is more about pace. If the energy transitions happen at a pace that is rapid, then either that reinvestment is difficult to accomplish fast enough, or certain assets, become stranded. But the motivation here is to reinvest into energy transitions, not to avoid a stranded asset.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, I want to turn to Axel now. Axel, how does Uniper see hydrogen fitting into its strategy, particularly as it pursues net zero power operations by 2035?
For us, it's one of the major pillars of our strategy. We moved the direction of the company and transformed our assets, and the target is to be carbon neutral in Europe by 2035. So for us, it's one of the major pillars, hydrogen, and there are various elements. Some of them we have heard, so we clearly see hydrogen also as an enabler for renewables, which means with the fluctuating impact of renewables and the phase out, at least in Europe, of coal and also partly nuclear power stations, we just need the storage vector of hydrogen. And even more, there are a lot of industries that cannot handle full electrification. And consequently, we need a solution for them. These are our customers, and they are asking for green solutions. And there are also clearly some political incentives to move from a carbon-heavy industry to a decarbonized industry. And for us, our intention is to produce decarbonized hydrogen in Europe in future, and we already started doing that with pilot projects and have a project pipeline we would roll out within the next years. We would certainly also look into importing hydrogen and supplying trading hydrogen, because we strongly believe that in 5-10 years time, we will talk about hydrogen in a similar way we today talk about LNG. So consequently, we are discussing about an import facility for Europe, and also make use of this optimization potential, because some of the countries will not be able to just produce sufficient green hydrogen themselves. And consequently, the same way as today, they will depend on importing energy, and in future, this kind of energy and this kind of gas will be hydrogen. And last but not least, we transformed our power generation fleet already away from coal to gas and hydro. And of course, these gas-fired power stations, we use natural gas. Of course, we're discussing what's the integrity of those assets when we supply them with hydrogen in future. So that's probably a bit down the road. I don't see that as the first application to use hydrogen in power stations, but definitely in some years' time that will be discussed for further decarbonization.
Got it. Thank you. I want to move to Michael now. Now, Michael, you're on a panel with four representatives from various pieces of the oil and gas industry or hydrocarbon industry more broadly. You have written a couple of pretty serious pieces about hydrogen in the BNEF blog last fall that takes some of the things that we've heard today to task and agrees with others. I want to get to that, but I first want to ask you, sitting not in the hydrocarbon industry, but a bit outside, how do you see John Kerry's challenge to the industry? Do you think that's the right approach?
Oh, I think, let me say, first of all, yes, I think that the challenge, John Kerry's challenge is absolutely spot on, because I see no version of the future where we can get to net zero without a really healthy hydrogen sector. That's the first point. And the second point, I can't see a healthy hydrogen sector without a healthy involvement from the current petrochemicals, current oil and gas players. And so I think he's absolutely right to stand up and say, there is everything to play for. I had to look up what a jump ball is. I'm not exactly built like a member of the US Dream Team basketball players, so I had to look that up. But that's absolutely spot on. It is a jump ball. And there's a lot of noise in the space about how the oil and gas companies should be excluded from the transition for some past misdemeanors and so on. I mean, that's all kind of nonsense, because you're not going to achieve this dramatic handbrake turn of so much of the global industry without an involvement of the companies who've got the best skills in so many of the technologies and aspects of what that transition is going to include. And so his challenge was absolutely spot on. Yes.
Fantastic, and that's great to hear that we're all sort of on the right track here in this approach. Now your blog posts from the fall were critical of some of the ways in which we're approaching hydrogen and really supportive of some of the other ways. And so I think this goes to a good question we have from a member of the audience, and the audience questions are starting to come in. And this one is from Annalise Gegenheimer, and this is where I wanted to go too. So Annalise, our brains are working in the same direction. But Michael, what do you think of the best use cases and industries are for hydrogen? Where is it actually going to make a difference for decarbonization? And where do we see this as sort of the potential for hydrogen hype 4.0? Because there have been at least three cycles previously where hydrogen was the solution and then it didn't really work out.
Well, that's right. So every 20 years, there's this enormous sort of, effusion of hype around hydrogen. And I think before I answer the question about which sectors, where it will work and where it might not, I think it's very important to sort of back up one stage and say that, some of that hype is around what hydrogen can do, because it can power transportation and it can be used as a feedstock for petchem and of course fertilizer, and it could power aircraft and it could heat our homes and it could provide resilience and so on. So there's part of the hype is around, well, we should just change everything over. It's as simple as that. It's the everything molecule, so let's change everything. And that crucially is not how industrial transitions work. Even the digital transition had to be won segment by segment. We still use paper, we still read paper books, we still give business cards. We didn't just say, oh, digital is better than analog, so everything goes digital without question. So hydrogen, to your question, it will win segment by segment, use case by use case. It has to win. And that's where you start to get use cases where clearly clean hydrogen of some sort, whether it's green, whether it's blue, whether it's some other funky color, but low carbon hydrogen has to be part of the solution for things like fertilizer, for ammonia production. We use gray hydrogen now with a huge carbon footprint, so clearly that's going to go. Same with hydrogen use in petrochemicals. Generally, where there's no other good solution. So you look at aircraft and you think about, okay, probably e-fuels for aircraft. I mean, it's between hydrogen and maybe some kind of biofuel solution, but that looks pretty promising. Steel, it's very difficult to do steel without using a coking coal. So that's a good use case for hydrogen. It might go to direct electrical reduction. There's a good chance, but hydrogen is in with a good chance as well. Shipping fuel, very difficult to see how we fuel ships. Ammonia is being touted as the solution, and you say, well, I can't think, maybe it's methanol, but either way, it could well go through a hydrogen stage in the production of that solution. Resilience on the grid. We've got in Northern Europe, the biggest problem we have is where there's 2-3 weeks without offshore wind. And that can happen. You can have a high pressure during winter. There's very little solar in Northern Europe. We can have some interconnections from elsewhere, but that 2-3 week period where batteries are not going to cut it. They're going to be too expensive to have 3 weeks of batteries to power all of Northern Europe's economy. And so you look for probably a molecule, and hydrogen, you can store it in a salt cavern, looks like, potentially being part of the solution, and then running it through one of Axel's turbines, and you could have a very resilient, very robust system, and very difficult to see how else you could do it. The problem just comes where there are alternatives, because for all of the benefits of hydrogen, there are disbenefits. Producing it uses work, to use a thermodynamic term. In other words, it costs money. Converting it back, also, it's not 100% efficient. It's got a cycle. If you want to use it as a storage mechanism, it only has something like a 50% storage efficiency at best. Moving it around in a pipeline is great. Moving it around in a ship is very expensive. Moving around, so there are lots of disadvantages. It's very light, but it's very diffuse. It's not bulky unless you take it to, Jill would freeze it down to minus 253 C. She'd be happy to do that, but that's a complicated process. So essentially, where there are alternatives, you probably want to do them. And that might be direct, just use the electricity immediately it's produced, or it might, where it's economically feasible, be use a battery. So things like ground transportation, almost all of it is going to go to direct battery electric. Even the longer distance, even the heavier stuff, most of it is going to go to battery electric. Heating in homes, for all that, Wayne wants to say, oh no, we want to reinvest in assets. I'll tell you, the distribution gas network people are not thinking like that. They're thinking, gee, there's a huge write-off of our assets unless we do hydrogen boilers for space heating. We're not going to. It just doesn't make sense as an economic solution. So I'm sometimes billed to sum up as a hydrogen hater. I'm not. I'm a lover of hydrogen, but it's got to be in places where the microeconomics, the thermodynamics, the finance, all those things make sense. Otherwise, it's not going to cut it. And we should stick to where it does make sense.
Michael, thank you so much. I know that there's going to be some pushback from our other panelists, and I want to see a little bit of sparks flying, I hope. Like in the Democratic presidential debates, for those who watch them, if your name was called out, we'll go to you for sure. He did say, Wayne, your name. So Wayne, do you have any response to Michael's comment?
Sure, and I think it's really deepening. It's a great topic, and I think it's really deepening. A couple things Michael said very well. I thought, focusing on the end outcome of the benefits of hydrogen, including the carbon intensity, is really good. We think of that as a voice of a customer. It's the social good that we are trying to achieve, and so indeed that's an important signal to get the right hydrogen production pathways and supply set up. In terms of mobility and road transport, we are developing hydrogen fueling stations, and so we have a somewhat different view. We often hear it start out as vehicle class. Well, will light duty vehicles or heavy duty vehicles use what fuels? My first pivot from that is to think about use case. So I appreciate that you framed it as use case, which is often captured as high output and high utilization, a place where the value proposition of fast refueling instead of somewhat slower charging resonates. And so forklifts are a good example where for indoor air quality, a zero emission choice is needed, and the high output and high utilization, the uptime of that asset is key to the business outcome, and hydrogen is doing very well in forklifts. You can extend that to then customer segments. In California, the average battery electric vehicle is driven between 6,000 and 9,000 miles a year, and the average fuel cell vehicle is driven between 9,000 and 14,000 miles a year. So you start to see customers choosing the option that works best for them. Charging at home is available for maybe up to half of Californians. Charging at home is not available to those who live in high-rise and multi-unit dwellings. There's efforts to improve on that. And then I would say the cost challenge with hydrogen. Again, I thought point well made on, use the electron directly if you can, but if it's not in the right time and place, or if the feedstock is another stranded resource of some kind, then it may be a lower cost feedstock. And so the economics of the thermodynamic inefficiencies are overcome by the economics of the feedstock. Give you a bit of our sense of progress. At Shell, we've doubled the performance and capacity of the refueling station while cutting the cost in half twice over the last 7 years. So not quite Moore's law, but pretty close in pace. And that gets us to a point of gasoline and diesel cost parity. Now, the big asterisk is with full utilization. So there still is this building of infrastructure capacity that is not used much. There's a ramp up of demand that needs to happen. There are important policy bridges to enable that we may touch upon. But as we achieve that cost for the service of fueling, we now are at parity or below for fast charging, while offering 10 to 100 times the level of service, the rate of charge. So again, it's more about customer segments, utility functions, for what individual customer or commercial fleet does a fast fueling of a electrified vehicle do better than a relatively slower charging of a battery?
I think this is, there's a lot we agree on here, and I think that this may be the road transportation, ground transportation may be the area where we see the biggest divergence in the pro hydrogen community about its role, hydrogen's role in ground transportation, and it reminds me a little bit of VHS and Betamax back in the day, and let's hope that the best technology wins, unlike VHS. I think that it's important that we see people developing both types of technologies. And Wayne, you're developing, but your colleagues are developing the fast charging for battery electric vehicles. So one of those two is probably going to win. And so let's just hope it's the best one.
No, I think Michael said it very well. It's segment by segment, and we think in terms of customer segments. So I at Shell, we are, heavily investing into charging of battery electric vehicles, even as we invest into fueling of hydrogen electric vehicles. We don't see it as one or the other winning or being better. We see them as very complementary and coexisting.
Got it. That will be interesting to see how it plays out over the next 10 years. And there's a different question about heavy transport, where the economics are different than passenger vehicles, which we can maybe get to. We do have a relevant question from the audience that I want to give to Jill here. This is from Henry Hetker, who notes that a hydrogen fueling station caught fire in Norway, probably in 2019. How can this be made safer? There are concerns out in the world about safety of hydrogen. So Jill, you wanted to take this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's three things I'd like to point out on this question. The first is some of the more recent issues on fueling stations and safety have been around high pressure storage stations. And what happens there is really you're holding hydrogen in this high pressure environment, and there's tubes and various different pieces and parts and components that can create the issues or make the issues happen more frequently. So one of the things that we're doing at Chart, and I'll just put a shameless plug in here for us, is developing around the liquid hydrogen storage station, because you're able to hold the hydrogen in lower pressure status and stage. And that makes a big difference when you're talking about safety. The second of the elements of my response is around standards and certifications. So this is still an early point in the industry, and there's certifications that happen at a very regional or country level. And as that evolves and matures, I think you're going to see more and more on the safety side of things. We actually invite our customers to come to our hydrogen test facility in Minnesota in the United States, where you can safely test various different technologies and processes, which goes to what Wayne was saying. There's different development and evolution on the technology side. And then the final point on safety in general is, when you're evaluating any of these molecules, if you hone in on this one in particular is more dangerous than another, go Google it, right? Just Saturday, you had a Tesla self-driving and explode, and took 4 hours to put the fire out, right? So you really got to think through, there's safety challenges in all of this, and safety needs to be top of mind, but that wouldn't be something that the industry is ignoring. That's a key part of how we think about the evolution of whatever molecule that we're putting our equipment into.
That's a great point, that the safety concerns are across a range of different technologies, need to be managed from a risk-based perspective, and not used as sort of except in very serious cases, not used to prevent the deployment of those technologies. Just really understanding what they are and managing them, which can be done. There's plenty of hydrogen used in the world right now, and we manage that all very, very safely. The U.S. produces 10 million metric tons a year, so when we manage that all safely. We've talked a lot about the production side of hydrogen in various parts of your opening question, opening answers. And so I want to pivot to that now, first with a question from the audience, but then I want to widen the aperture after that. So the question from the audience is from Vinay Mulganmath, and he asks, green hydrogen may seem like a silver bullet to fill gaps where electrification fails. However, it impacts another critical resource, water. In places like California, green hydrogen will have to compete with scarce water resources. What are your thoughts? So Axel, let's go to you first on that.
Yeah, I think it's a very relevant topic and a good question, actually. First of all, we already pointed out that there is not the silver bullet. So the question is it a better solution than we had before? And I strongly believe green hydrogen definitely is. The issue of water needs to be considered. And actually, of course, that needs fresh water and those resources. And that might be an issue in particular because talking about the production of green hydrogen often, in particular, if we combine it with solar, with photovoltaics, then we are in areas of this planet where actually there is not a lot of water. Yeah. So first of all, one consideration is other forms of producing energy also need a lot of water. Yeah, if we have steam methane reforming based on gas, actually we need more water than an electrolysis would need. So having said that, we still need to be careful, and there are plans in several projects to run desalination facilities. So to avoid the use of fresh water, but to use seawater. Two topics to be considered, of course. You need to power these desalination facilities with green electricity because it would be a bit ridiculous to run them on oil. That's for sure. And another topic is the desalination of seawater. Actually, you have a brine as a byproduct, so salt. So that also needs some environmental considerations. So I think my answer shows that the industry is discussing that. And also the regulatory frameworks and environmental authorities are discussing that already. It can be tackled, but nevertheless, it's a good question, and therefore we have to pay attention that we really consider the entire value chain and the entire footprint of a certain technology. And I think that holds true for hydrogen, but also for oil and gas. Always look at the entire value chain.
Got it. It seems like you'd need to have a huge surplus of renewable power in order to power the desal facility to then produce the hydrogen from that desalinated water to get some green hydrogen. You'd really need a lot of renewable power and really need that hydrogen very badly.
Actually, the additional cost if you add a desalination facility are minor. They would be below 5% if you take the entire value chain into account. So it's manageable, I believe.
If I may add, two different feedstocks to produce hydrogen. We're pulling off a different molecule. So if it's H2O, indeed, water is a feedstock. If it's a carbonaceous feedstock of some kind, a methane or longer hydrocarbon chain, then it's carbons being pulled off. But indeed, a steam methane reforming process, you have to think about the steam and is it recovered. And then having made that point, if it's electrolysis, water as a feedstock, the consumption might be about 40% less water than refining oil.
Fair enough. These comparisons are really, really worth making. And you make, Wayne, a very good point about the multiple feedstocks and the multiple ways of producing hydrogen. It puts the conversation about blue and green and turquoise and pink and yellow and whatnot. It's a little bit ridiculous. Those are great placeholders for a process, but we shouldn't necessarily think of those as the right way. The green hydrogen is necessarily the only way to produce clean hydrogen. And so equivalent using green as an equivalent for clean is probably a mistake. We've published at the Atlantic Council a recent paper with the hashtag carbon, not color. So I encourage everyone to read that and focus on the embodied carbon in the hydrogen molecule to produce that hydrogen molecule. But this is a problem for the hydrocarbon industry in that the hydrocarbon industry has often talked about blue hydrogen, so hydrogen produced through with natural gas through steam methane reforming. But and so that has sort of challenged the hydrogen industry, challenged the hydrogen plans of the EU. That there are folks who argue that it's hydrogen produced from renewable power or nothing else. However, just some very quick math suggests that it's very hard to get to any sort of scale for hydrogen without other sources beyond just renewable power or so-called green hydrogen. Just for some of this math, it's in a forthcoming paper. If you assume some of the most efficient electrolyzers with offshore wind get a capacity factor of 50%, so very high capacity factor of the renewables and a very high efficiency. If you want to just match the current hydrogen production in the United States, you need roughly 115 gigawatts of installed offshore wind. That's a lot when when the U.S. is aiming for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So that seems to be producing enough hydrogen is a challenge. Producing enough hydrogen with electrolysis from variable renewable power. I'd like to ask all of you your thoughts on the ways in which we produce hydrogen and what methods we should be investing in addition to, and this is critical, we need to keep driving down the cost of electrolyzers, but in addition to investing in electrolyzers, what else should we be investing in? Now, Cosma, I know SNAM has had a bunch of success with hydrogen, deploying it in industrial settings. So what is SNAM thinking about? You're not necessarily going to be producing it, but where are you seeing your suppliers investing in? Where would you like to see more investment?
Well, we're seeing three areas that are worth, I think, investigating. One is called what we would call circular hydrogen. So it's basically hydrogen from treatment of waste, right? There are a number of different ways in which technologically you can extract hydrogen from waste and even from non-recyclable plastics, for example. And that's an area that would allow to produce hydrogen and at the same time remove one of the issues that we are not able to tackle at the moment, which is managing certain types of plastics. That's technology number one. Technology number two is what we call portable or small-scale blue hydrogen. So there's an opportunity also not to create mega complex of blue hydrogen productions, but distributed blue hydrogen production, which then with proper off-takers, which would require an evolution of the construction industry, would actually allow to entrap CO2 that is actually captured. So that's technology number two that we are seeing. And for example, we're going to use it to power trains in northern Italy. And the technology number three is, of course, large-scale blue hydrogen with carbon capture. That's clearly an important element to achieve our targets in terms of hydrogen production. I would complete by saying that another area of technology that I think we should focus on is the technology that will allow us to transport hydrogen among continents. That will be a huge area of development, we think, in the coming years. I think that one of the panelists before talks about hydrogen as a potential new LNG. We also believe that that could be one of the areas of development. We clearly see some areas in the world that are pushing to become net exporters of green hydrogen. One of them is Australia, another one is the Middle East, with a huge push also from the Emirates after Saudi. So that's also an area that is worth exploring because there's no single standard yet, right? There's liquid hydrogen, liquid organic hydrogen carriers, but there's also other solutions such as ammonia, as Michael was mentioning before.
Got it. How do you think through this, the green, the color debate, and where Uniper sees it's going to source its hydrogen? Axel, you're on mute.
Someone has to do it, right? So I thought before we finish it, I should better do it. I agree to Cosma, and I think we have to be technology open. Green hydrogen has several advantages, and therefore there is a strong political push and momentum for that, in particular in Europe, and I agree to that. However, we need to broaden the scope and we need more. Just to add, I think the topic of pyrolysis or gas splitting is also relevant. So which means that methane CH4, we would split it into carbon C and hydrogen. we all know that the technology readiness level is still quite low. So I don't believe that any company in the world is able to do it on a larger scale. But I think it's something to investigate, something to do some research on, and that would clearly also have the great advantage that the still available huge natural gas resources, for example, in the US or in Russia or in Norway, could be used in an elegant way. Of course, you have the byproduct of carbon, but that can be either used in certain industries like tire industries, or it can be stored underground in an environmental friendly way. So therefore, I would add gas splitting with a caveat that it would take some years until we have developed it properly as an industry.
Got it. When we were talking in our prep call about the various ways in which Shell sees hydrogen production, maybe you could talk through some of the opportunities you see out there.
Yeah, and really it's just building on what's already been said. The diversity in pathways to produce hydrogen is a real strength because it means the best pathway can be developed in each market to the conditions of that market. Some places there might be abundant methane, fossil or renewable, abundant geology to capture carbon, and that those pathways look very good. Some places there might be abundant curtailed renewable electrons and from large scale wind and solar or hydro, and an electrolytic pathway looks better. So that diversity is wonderful, and again the end outcome, a signal from policy that what we are really trying to achieve is a decarbonized hydrogen, and oftentimes also a zero emission use of it for local air quality are important things. I think the one point I would emphasize again is your observation on scale, because also this diversity of how to produce hydrogen is really enabling for the range of scales where it might be developed, and the basic development of distributed infrastructure with its pros and cons versus centralized infrastructure. So as an example, in California, the nascent mobility demand is roughly 10 tons per day of hydrogen. A refinery might have several hundred tons per day of hydrogen production capacity, and blending 2% clean hydrogen into the natural gas system of California would be roughly 1,000 tons per day of hydrogen. So orders of magnitude difference in the scale. It's wonderful to have this diversity of production methods to build it right for each application.
Got it. Thank you. And Jill, you sit in the middle. Where are you seeing your customers making their investments on hydrogen production?
I think all three panelists already commented on the diversity of the ways you can produce the molecule, which I think is indicative of the way that technology evolves. But what I would say that we're seeing, and we've made numerous investments across the various ways to produce the molecule because, well, first and foremost, it pulls our equipment through. But I think that the comment by Wayne around there's different answers, and Michael said this in his earlier comment, right? It's not, you've got to do what makes the most sense. And right now, there's still not necessarily a rationality to the way that customer behaviors are happening around the various different approaches to this, but that's starting to move ahead. And what we're seeing is two different ends of the spectrum. One is people who just want to produce the largest amount of the molecule, and that can go into the size of the traditional electrolyzer, to what I would call next generation technology. And I want to produce the molecule of hydrogen, but I want to do so without creating CO2. So for example, we just made an investment in a company called Transform Materials, where they actually use microwave and plasma technology to produce hydrogen and acetylene, but they do so without oxygen. And so there's no CO2 created as part of the process. And Axel made Axel's comment about cracking of the molecule, right? So we're seeing more and more of that evolution. But in the current state today, it's about, I want to produce as much of the molecule as possible because the molecule's in demand and the supply isn't there.
Got it. That's the supply going to be an important bottleneck. Okay, Michael, you've heard from, again, you just heard from four oil and gas companies talking about the need for a wide range of production methods for hydrogen. And you've agreed with this in principle earlier on. What is the political messaging to get this across? How do we make the case that blue hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen, any form of low carbon hydrogen is important for the outcome we all want to see, and not just focus on the hydrogen produced from intermittent renewable power?
Okay, so I believe the Democratic debate rules, I would have been allowed back in afterwards because you said that I agreed with everybody, and it's relevant. The reason that the demand side is relevant, the earlier discussion, where, I mean, to be honest, I didn't agree, because I think that the ground transportation, the VHS Betamax, I mean, the problem with, look, VHS Betamax, the solutions were indistinguishable for the customer, right? Here, the solutions are not. The solutions are being chosen. The battery electric solution is cheaper, it's simpler, it's more efficient, it's there at vast scale, it's lower maintenance, it's you know, et cetera, and it's being chosen by customers. You know, and so, you know, to say, oh, well, you know, everything's up in the air. Now, the reason it matters is, for instance, Cosmo said, well, there are going to be trains in northern Italy using hydrogen. There are going to be no trains in northern Italy using hydrogen in the longer term. Absolutely none. It's a stupid solution, right? And so you'll have taxpayer money being spent on experimental this and that and the other. And maybe for very long distance trains somewhere, road trains across Australia, hydrogen might make sense. I don't know. But most of that stuff is going to go electric. Now, why does that matter? Because why it matters to get this stuff right is that the overwhelming majority of the use of hydrogen will be in industry, and it will be in hubs, and it will be centralized, and it will be important to produce it as cheaply as possible, but consistent with net zero. Right. And I said, now, where I did agree is that oil and gas companies have to be involved, right, either through their renewable energy activities or their clean energy activities, or through blue hydrogen. But then you've got to get rid of the fugitive emissions, which is a huge problem that we've not talked about. As soon as you start emitting any methane in the extraction, you can forget all the benefits of hydrogen, because you might as well just, you know, use coal, frankly, in that situation. And you also have to capture all of the CO2, plus or minus, right? 90%, not good enough. You will not get to net zero capturing 90% of the CO2 and then making blue hydrogen that way, or 85%, I think was the number that was used earlier. Now, there are technologies to capture much higher proportions. So I really like what Net Power is doing in the US with the alum cycle, because you could envisage a really sort of circular system. Well, not circular, because you'll take your natural gas, but using that, burning that in oxygen that is the byproduct of electrolysis. So that only produces water and CO2. You can capture the CO2 100%, and you've got yourself a really viable 100 or near 100% capture system. You get rid of the fugitive methane emissions, and you do that, you might well get a really clean blue hydrogen. But if it's just kind of, well, you know, we get to 85%, that's good enough, and there's 2% fugitive emissions, so on, that ain't clean. That is not going to get us to net zero. So, so I think those were my points. You know, think about it at industrial scale. Green hydrogen will get there, and it will get there cheaply. It'll be coming from Morocco. It'll be coming from Chile. It'll be coming from the places with cheap wind and solar. And that's what the oil and gas sector has to beat if it wants to take up Secretary Kerry's challenge, but it wants to do it through blue hydrogen. That's what it's going to have to beat. And it's not going to be easy. And it's not going to be by doing cutesy things around service stations and a few more hydrogen filling stations in California. It's going to do it by razor sharp focus on that issue. Net zero, zero emissions, zero fugitive emissions, blue hydrogen, if it wants to do natural gas hydrogen, and not anything else, which we've heard of from today.
Michael, thank you. And I apologize if I implied that you had agreed on the transportation piece. I only meant that you had agreed on the production side, that the color isn't so much the issue, it's the carbon piece. But I also want to take issue with the idea that Betamax and VHS were indistinguishable. I can tell you that people still think Betamax was a better format, a higher quality. We are over time, but I want to give everybody 30 seconds closing remarks. We're going to go in the same order we started, of what you would like to see on hydrogen come out of the climate summit this week. So we started with Jill. So Jill, 30 seconds.
I'll take less time than that. What I'd like to see come out of it is additional increased attention from both the public and the private sector. And you can see that through the industry coalitions such as Hydrogen Forward. But I think that, again, that increased and laser focus on where it makes sense to be involved in the answer.
Thank you. Wayne.
We've been working on hydrogen for 30 or 40 years, tremendous pace in the last 10 years. Collaboration is absolutely key. No one has all the ingredients. Acceleration and scale are incredibly enabling. And then policy bridges to get things started are necessary. And with those, the world will compete and determine the things on which we've pontificated today.
Cosma.
I would like to see, a global framework for hydrogen starting to emerge. Right now, we are seeing a number of country-by-country agreements. Germany is very active, for example, at the moment. I think it's time for a global framework to emerge here.
That would be very interesting if that were to come out. Axel.
Yeah, I would like to see a narrative we jointly develop for the various stakeholders, such as customers, but also politicians and exporting nations. And based on that, I think international cooperation is relevant to commercialize the topic of hydrogen, not only think in production, but also in the entire supply chain and in a future liquid global hydrogen market.
Thank you. And Michael.
So on the supply side, I would like to see some standards for good hydrogen, not the colors, but good hydrogen, which has no methane emissions and no CO2 emissions, or as near as damn it to that. Then I would like to see on the demand side, more focus on the areas where only hydrogen looks promising as a solution, and less focus on areas where it's pretty darn clear already that hydrogen is not going to be the solution.
Michael, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. On Michael's point about areas where hydrogen might be the only solution, just so you all know, we actually have Airbus talking about their hydrogen planes. That'll be next Tuesday as part of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center's Innovation Stream program. So that should be really interesting to see how they're approaching it. So thank you all for tuning in today. Again, thank you to all the panelists for your really valuable insights. This presentation will be available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please do share it with your colleagues. Please also join us for several other Raising Ambition events happening throughout the week. The Global Energy Center, later this afternoon, we'll be having an event discussing the role of nature-based climate solutions. That's 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And then at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, an event on energy and environmental justice. Tomorrow, now this event's not yet on our website. I don't think it is yet. It wasn't when I started this event. We will have Indian Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas and Steel, Dharmendra Pradhan. He'll be speaking at 8 a.m. about John Kerry's recent visit to India and how the country views its decarbonization pathway. I am told he will be talking about hydrogen as well. You can find out information for all the rest of our Raising Ambitions events, the rest of the week's programming on the Global Energy Center's website, with of course maybe still the exception of the 8 a.m. event tomorrow morning. Thank you for everyone who helped put this event together, in particular Laura Macedo, Roger Morales, David Yellen, John Suen, and Maria Castillo. And again, thank you to all the panelists. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in real life sometime very soon. Have a good rest of the afternoon, everyone.